Okay, in this video, I want to talk about monetary policy. So we're going to cover two topics at once. We'll have a look at topic, in fact, it's only one, sorry, 3.6. Oh no, 3.6 and 4.11 again, explain the monetarist policies. Okay, so basically monetary policy. Okay. First thing, monetary, and that's a difference. That's one thing that you should really say because it distinguishes monetary policy from fiscal policy. Monetary policy is designed and implemented by the central bank, by the country's central bank. In Switzerland, it's the SNB, the Swiss National Bank. In the US, it's the Federal Reserve. In the European Union, it's the European Central Bank. The country has its own central bank. You just check. Okay. Seems to be working. That's the first, and in fact, the main difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now, monetary policy is just like fiscal policy, a demand-side policies. Okay, so there are two main types of demand-side policies: fiscal policy and monetary policy. And therefore, graphically speaking, it's going to be exactly the same. If you look at your notebooks, we didn't graph everything for anything for monetary policy because it's exactly the same. We'll have to distinguish the monetarist model from the Keynesian model. We'll have to distinguish the short run versus the long run in the monetarist model and the different levels of spare capacity in the Keynesian model. But the consequences are exactly the same. You have an expansionary monetary policy where you increase AD, and the purpose of this video is to understand how this can happen. And you have a contractionary monetary policy where you decrease AD. Okay, consequences in terms of macroeconomic objectives are the same, and just like fiscal policy, you often have to trade off between your main macroeconomic objectives. It's either growth and low unemployment with an expansionary monetary policy, or low inflation with a contractionary monetary policy. Okay, so what I'm mostly interested in this video is to understand how the central bank can influence AD. What instrument can the central bank use to increase or decrease aggregate demand? That really is the purpose of this video. And the mechanism that allows the central bank to influence AD is something that we call the transmission mechanism. And what you really have to understand, that is, we're going to work backward, is that AD is going to shift because the interest rate is shifting. Okay, so here what really matters is the rate of interest, the interest rate. That's the main instrument that the central bank is going to influence. I'll explain that the central bank does not control the interest rate directly, but it can influence it. And these are the changes in the rate of interest that are going to lead to a shift in AD. So let's try to understand why the rate of interest is going to influence AD. So just like we did for fiscal policy, let's just write the equation of AD. And let's try to understand how the rate of interest is going to influence each component apart from this one. The rate of interest is not going to have any significant influence on government spending. You could argue that, yes, if it's cheap to borrow, the government can spend more. Why not? But let's try to focus on consumption, investment, and net exports. Well, on consumption, the effect is quite obvious. If the interest rate is very low, it means that it's cheap for people to borrow money, let's say to buy a house or to buy a car, and therefore they will borrow more and they will consume more. On the other hand, if the rate of interest is very high, expensive to borrow, so they will consume less. Also, you can recognize that a high rate of interest will encourage savings, because the interest rate is the reward when you save. It's the cost when you borrow, but it is the reward when you save. And therefore, a high rate of interest will discourage consumption. People have greater incentives to save. On the other hand, a low rate of interest is going to encourage consumption, and it's going to discourage saving. So there is a consumption savings trade-off that is influenced by the rate of interest. Investment is pretty much the same, but here we are mostly talking about businesses who can either borrow or save. In order for them to invest, they very often have to borrow, either by taking out loans or by selling bonds. And in both cases, a high rate of interest is going to make it expensive for them to borrow. And this is something that can reduce investment spending because, well, they feel like borrowing is too costly. Okay, so that's why a high rate of interest will discourage investment. A low rate of interest is going to encourage investment. And finally, but again, I skip government spending. Like I said, we could argue that if it is cheap to borrow, the government may have an incentive to spend more to run a greater budget deficit because it knows that it can borrow at a lower cost, perhaps, but it's okay if we ignore it. There is an interesting impact on international trade, and that's the hot money argument. The idea is that if the rate of interest goes up, it means that saving money in our country is more rewarding than before. Okay, saving money or basically buying assets that generate like payments, like could be government bonds, could be stocks, anything, right? The assets in our countries have become more attractive because they pay a higher rate of interest. And because of that, it's going to attract money from abroad. People abroad say, hey, wait a minute, look at the rate of interest in that country. It's very high. I should buy assets in this country because there will be a high reward. So there will be an inflow of something that we call hot money. There is an inflow of hot money, and therefore the demand for our currency will increase. And as the demand for our currency increases, the exchange rate will go up. So our currency will appreciate. And as our currency appreciates, it makes our exports more expensive for people abroad and imports cheaper for people at home. So it's the higher exchange rate, the stronger currency, will discourage exports and encourage imports. So net exports will go down when the interest rate goes up. On the other hand, if the interest rate goes down in our country, that makes our assets not very attractive, right? Because the reward is not very high. The people abroad, they don't really want to buy our assets anymore. On the other hand, people in our country, they would rather buy assets abroad because now those foreign assets, they are relatively more attractive. The result is that the demand for our currency will decrease because people abroad, they no longer want to buy our assets. And at the same time, the supply of our currency will increase because people at home, they want to buy foreign assets. Well, basically, this combination will lead to a decrease in the exchange rate. Remember, when the interest rate goes down, the exchange rate goes down as well. So our currency will depreciate. It's going to become weaker. And in terms of international trade, that's pretty good because the lower exchange rate, the weaker currency, makes exports cheaper for people abroad. So we can export more. And it makes imports more expensive for people in our country. And therefore, imports will go down. So more exports, less imports, AD will go up. Okay, so that's really important that you understand that the impact that a change in the rate of interest will have on aggregate demand. Now, what we have to do is to understand how the central bank can influence the interest rate, because it does not set the interest rate at which people will borrow to buy a house or borrow to buy a car, anything like that. But the central bank can influence the interest rate by influencing the money supply. And that is something that I'm going to explain in a minute. So it all has to do with what we call the market for money. The money market. That's basically, there are several ways we can introduce it, but let's just, I don't remember how I presented it in class because there are usually two ways, which are pretty much equivalent. Well, hopefully, I'm doing it the same way as I did in class. Okay, the money market just basically shows how much money is supplied, so this is the quantity of money, and this is the price of money, which is the interest rate. Why? Because, well, when we, for example, when we borrow money, well, the price of receiving money is the rate of interest, and when we supply money, when we save or we lend money, we receive the rate of interest. Okay, so that's basically the price of money. The supply of money is controlled by the central bank. SM for money supply. Okay, it is central bank will, again, we'll see how the central bank can influence the money supply. So just we are working backward. Okay, but just keep that in mind, is that it's a fixed amount, so that's why it's vertical. Okay, it's a fixed amount that is set or at least influenced by the central bank. And the demand for money comes from whoever in the economy needs money to buy goods and services, but also as a precaution, they may just keep money available just in case they need to spend money. But mostly when we talk about the demand for money, well, why do we need money? We need money to buy goods and services. This is what we call the transactions motive. We demand money to buy goods and services, mostly. So you see that it is just like in any market, basically. It is the interaction of supply and demand that is going to determine, the equilibrium rate of interest. Okay. And just like in any market, if there is either a change in the supply or the demand, the rate of interest is going to change. In particular, if the central bank decides to increase the amount of money, which is what SM2, okay, so you have like a rightward shift of the money supply, then you see that the equilibrium rate of interest is going to go down. We'll have a decrease in the rate of interest. So more or greater money supply leads to a lower rate of interest. On the other hand, if the central bank takes some actions that are meant to decrease the money supply, I'm going to run out of space a little. You see that we are going to have, so it's not the best diagram. 1, 2, 1, 2. We are now going to have a higher rate of interest, I3. So that the easiest way to illustrate how changes in the money supply will bring about changes in the rate of interest. And then we know that changes in the rate of interest will affect AD. Okay? Remember, this is how you explain these diagrams. Okay, quantity of money, price of money is the rate of interest. And then the money supply is like a vertical line because it is a fixed amount that is influenced by the central bank. The demand for money comes from those who need to have money so they can buy goods and services, mostly, even though it's not the only reason. Remember, there is a precautionary motive. We just want to hold money just in case. And then an increase in the money supply will lead to a lower rate of interest, and a decrease in money supply will lead to a higher rate of interest. So we have taken one step back, but now we need to understand how can the central bank increase or decrease the money supply. It's not just printing money, the process is a bit more complex, and we'll see that there are 3 main ways in which the central bank can influence the money supply. So, the first thing that must be understood is that the central bank does not control the money supply directly. My point is that the central bank does not create money as such. It may be able to print money, but then, as long as it holds it in its vault, it's not part of the money supply, right? It's not in circulation. So just keep that in mind. It is not the central bank who creates most of the money that is circulating in the economy, which is part of the money supply. So who's creating money? Mostly commercial banks. Remember that the new money is being created as soon as commercial banks make new loans. And that's the example that I took. Imagine that you go to the bank, you give $100 to the bank. Let's write it down. So you deposit $100, and the bank will have to keep a fraction because there is something that is known as the reserve or the minimum reserve requirement. Minimum reserve requirement. Could be 10%, for example. I believe in Switzerland it's 2.5%. In the US, I think it's still 0%. But that's basically the share of deposits that commercial banks are required to keep. Yeah, they can't lend it. So let's say it's 10%, for example. Of course, it's possible that the bank will keep more. It's possible that the commercial bank will keep 20%. This is just the minimum, okay? So the minimum here would be out of the $100 of deposits, the commercial bank has to keep at least 10, at least 10. Let's imagine that, well, the commercial bank keeps 10, okay? So this goes into the reserves, can be held in cash, or could be on their account at the central bank. Okay, remember that commercial banks have an account at the central bank, and all the money that they deposit at the central bank is part of their reserves. And let's say that the rest is being lent out. That's a new loan. So let's analyze what happened. Let's start from the situation where there was this deposit. Okay, let's say it's Amaya. Amaya has deposited $100, so she has $100, and let's say the new loan goes to Nastya. As the bank makes the new loan, Amaya still has $100 on her bank account, right? Doesn't matter what the bank does with her money, she still has $100 on her account. And now Nastya has $90 on her account. It's a loan, but it's money she has, right? And she will ultimately have to pay back. That's what she has. So you see that when the bank made a new loan, it created money, and we often say out of thin air, basically to mean out of nothing, okay? Just by giving out, extended this new loan, the commercial bank has created $90 of new money. And that's mostly how money creation works, right? When banks make more loans. So, like I said, it's not really the central bank who controls the money supply directly, but something that we must recognize is that the central bank can influence the extension of new loans. The central bank can make it more or less difficult for commercial banks to make new loans. Okay, if the central bank makes it very easy for commercial banks to make a lot of loans, then the money supply will increase a lot and the rate of interest is going to decrease. On the other hand, if the central bank makes it very difficult for commercial banks to make loans, the money supply, so banks, they will extend much fewer loans than before. Therefore, the money supply will decrease, and as the money supply decreases, the rate of interest goes up. Okay, so remember, when we talk about monetary policy, ultimately the objective is to influence the rate of interest. That's what's going to shift AD. To influence the rate of interest, we must influence the money supply, and to influence the money supply, the central bank has to make it either harder or easier for commercial banks to extend new loans. There are three main ways in which a commercial bank can achieve that. I'll start with the one that is most common. OMOs, open market operation. So that's really the main way in which monetary policy is being conducted. What it means is that the central bank is going to trade government bonds with commercial banks. In most cases, the central bank is not authorized to trade government bonds directly with the government. And we understand why, because if the central bank could buy government bonds, well, that would basically mean that the government could have any budget deficit it wants, and the central bank would simply just buy the bonds and finance the deficit. And you see that there is a risk, right? Because this could lead to inflation. So in most cases, including in Europe, in Switzerland, and in the US, for example, the central bank is not entitled to trade directly with the government. But the central bank is allowed to trade government bonds with commercial banks. So it could be a situation where you have the government, the commercial banks, and the central bank. Imagine the government has a budget deficit. Say, oh, I need money. Who wants to give me money? Central bank can't. But commercial banks can say, okay, yeah, we'll buy your bonds. So central banks, they give money to the government, and the government will give bonds. It's like an IOU, okay? Of course, later, commercial banks will be repaid. But then commercial banks, they now have plenty of government bonds. They, they may not want to keep them forever. They may not want to hold these bonds until they mature. They may want to resell them. And now they are allowed to trade, to resell those bonds to the central bank in the open market. Open market is like the second-hand market. Okay, this is the primary market, where the commercial bank buys directly from the government who has issued the bonds, but then the commercial bank can resell this second-hand bond to anyone, another bank, a private firm, people abroad, or the central bank. And of course, in that case, the central bank, if the central bank has purchased bonds from commercial banks, in exchange, the central bank is going to give money to commercial banks. So in that case, when you think about it, if the central bank purchases bonds from commercial banks will receive more money. And now that commercial banks have more money, they can make more loans. So the money supply will increase and the rate of interest will decrease. That's what we call an open market purchase. Open market purchase. When the central bank purchases government bonds from commercial banks. On the other hand, it's perfectly possible that the central bank sells government bonds to commercial banks. And it goes the other way around. From the central bank to the commercial bank, you have the bonds. And from the commercial bank to the central bank, you have money. This is what we call an open market sale. When the central bank sells government bonds to commercial banks. And in that case, okay, so the commercial banks, they receive the bonds, but they have to pay money to the central bank. So now that commercial banks have less money than before, they can make fewer loans. And so the money supply will decrease. So basically, if you want your monetary policy to be expansionary, you should engage in open market purchases. You give money to commercial banks, they make more loans, the money supply increases, the rate of interest goes down, it increases. It's a long process. And if you want your monetary policy to be contractionary, you should use open market sales. You sell bonds to commercial banks, they have less money, they make fewer loans, the money supply decreases, the rate of interest increases, and aggregate demand decreases. So that is the primary instrument of monetary policy. There are two others that are, and by the way, I forgot something to mention, that whenever there is a very severe recession, very often central banks, in order to support the economy, they want to implement a monetary policy that is very expansionary. And one way in which they can do that is to buy massive amounts of government bonds from commercial banks. Okay, so in that case, when there is a very severe recession, like a negative shock in the economy, very often central banks, they buy massive amounts of government bonds from commercial banks and this is something that is known as quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is just like a large-scale open market purchase. Okay. Now, the two other instruments that are not used as often as open market operations, but of course, as I mentioned, there is the minimum of the required reserve ratio, which is the same as the minimum reserve ratio, which was, like, in my previous example, 10%. By changing this percentage, we can influence the money supply. Think about it. If you lower this reserve ratio, let's say from 10 to 5%, initially banks had to keep 10%. Now they only have to keep 5%. Well, so they can make more loans. And as they make more loans, the money supply increases, the rate of interest decreases, and AD increases. So that if you lower the required reserve ratio, you implement an expansionary monetary policy. On the other hand, if you increase the required reserve ratio, let's say from 10 to 20%, now commercial banks have to keep more of their deposits, meaning that they have less money available to make loans. The money supply will decrease, the interest rate will go up, and AT will decrease. So increasing the required reserve ratio is something that can make your monetary policy contractionary. And finally, you have the discount or base rate, which is the rate at which commercial banks can borrow from the central bank. Remember, we said that the central bank is basically the bank of commercial banks, or at least that is one function of central banks. They can lend money to commercial banks. And why is it something that can influence the process of money creation? Because imagine if the discount rate is extremely low, which means that it's very, let's say, 0.5%. So it's very cheap for commercial banks to borrow from the central bank. So essentially the cost of acquiring money is very low. And so it means that commercial banks will be able to offer loans at a relatively low rate of interest, maybe 1%, okay? And they keep the difference, okay? The commercial banks, they borrow from the central bank at 0.5%, and then they extend loans at 1%. 1% is quite low, right? So there will be a lot of people who want to borrow money, and therefore commercial banks will make a lot of loans, okay? And so the money supply will increase and so on. On the other hand, when the discount rate is high, let's say 4%, for example, it means that it's quite expensive for commercial banks to borrow from the central bank. And so if it chooses to borrow from the central bank at 4%, well, in that case, it may have to extend loans at, let's say, around 5% and keep the difference. Okay, that's how commercial banks can make profit. That's their cost, and that's what they will receive eventually. But at 5%, it's a lot. It's expensive, so there will be much fewer people and businesses who want to borrow. Okay, 5%, too expensive. And so the quantity of loans that they will make will be much lower. Okay, that's why. That's one reason for which the discount rate can influence the process of money creation. So if you want to implement an expansionary monetary policy, you should reduce the discount rate, okay, to allow commercial banks to borrow at a lower cost. And on the other hand, if you want to implement a contractionary monetary policy, you need to increase the discount rate just to make it more expensive for commercial banks to borrow from you. And so this is something that is going to contract the demand for loans as the cost is much higher. So these are the three main instruments that central banks can use to influence the process of money creation, to influence the money supply, and in turn to influence the rate of interest. Okay, that's about it.